"I can make your mother walk again," said the beggar boy to the rich man in tears. Richard Mitchell was breaking down in tears as he pushed his mother's wheelchair through the central square of Portland. Mrs. Margaret had spent the last 5 years unable to take a single step, and the doctors had lost all hope she would ever walk again. That's when he felt a presence beside him. Turning, he saw a thin boy in torn, dirty clothes, no older than 13. "You're crying because of the lady in the wheelchair, aren't you?" the boy asked in a soft but determined voice. Richard looked at the boy with suspicion. How dare this dirty child approach him and his mother in the middle of the square? "Go away, kid. We don't have money to give," Richard said, trying to shoo the boy off. "I can make your mother walk again," the boy said, completely ignoring the man's harshness. Richard abruptly stopped pushing the wheelchair. Those words echoed in his mind like a painful reminder of all the empty promises he'd heard over those terrible 5 years. "Who are you? How dare you joke about something like this?" Richard responded with growing anger. "My name is Jake, and I'm not joking," the boy replied, stepping closer to the wheelchair. "Mrs. Margaret, you fell in the bathroom 5 years ago, hurt your back, and since then, you've never really tried to walk again, have you?" Mrs. Margaret, who had remained silent until then, lifted her eyes and stared at the boy in surprise. No one outside the family and doctors knew the details of her accident. "How do you know that?" she asked weakly but curiously. Jake knelt beside the wheelchair, at eye level with the woman, and for the first time Richard got a close look at that thin face with bright, determined eyes. "I used to sleep under the awning at Mercy General Hospital, where you had physical therapy about 2 years ago. I was there every night, and during the day I'd watch through the therapy room window. I saw you trying to walk, saw the exercises they did with you." Richard felt a shiver run down his spine. Mercy General Hospital was on the other side of town. How could this street kid know something so specific? "Wait a minute," Richard interrupted, his voice trembling with restrained emotion. "Are you saying you watched my mother doing therapy?" "Not just her," Jake answered simply. "I watched everyone. I learned every exercise, every movement, every way to help someone walk again. I kept it all here," he said, tapping his forehead lightly. Mrs. Margaret reached a trembling hand toward the boy. There was something in his eyes that moved her deeply, a mix of determination and sadness she recognized all too well. "Why did you do that, son?" she asked gently. Jake lowered his eyes for a moment, as if gathering courage to share something painful. "My grandmother, Mrs. Beatrice, was in a wheelchair for 3 years before she passed. I was too young then, didn't know how to help. I promised her I'd learn to help other grandmothers walk again." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant noise of traffic and the chirping of birds in the square's trees. Richard felt his anger slowly turning into something he couldn't define. "Even if you've watched some exercises," Richard said, trying to keep his voice steady, "that doesn't mean you can help my mother. She's had therapy with the best professionals in the country." Jake stood up and began making odd movements with his hands, as if manipulating something invisible in the air. "Your problem, Mrs. Margaret, isn't just your back. You feel pain in your legs when you try to move, but it's not a pain from your body. It's a pain in the heart," said the boy, looking directly into the woman's eyes. Mrs. Margaret felt tears beginning to well up. How could this boy know exactly what she was feeling? "You're afraid to try walking because you're scared of falling again, and you're afraid of being a burden to your son," Jake continued, with a wisdom that seemed impossible for his age. Richard opened his mouth to object, but the words stuck in his throat. That was exactly what his mother had confided in him during sleepless, desperate nights. "Let me show you a simple exercise," said Jake, kneeling down again. "Just wiggle your big toe, nothing more." "No!" Richard exclaimed abruptly. "I won't let you touch my mother. You could hurt her even more." "Richard, son," Mrs. Margaret spoke for the first time with a firmer voice. "Let the boy try. What do I have to lose?" "What do you have to lose?" Richard raised his voice, drawing the attention of some people passing through the square. "Mom, you could get hurt. It could make things worse." "Worse how, Richard?" Mrs. Margaret asked with deep sadness in her voice. "It's been 5 years since I took a single step. 5 years of waking up every day feeling like a burden to you. How could it be worse than that? Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. His mother's words hit Richard like a punch to the gut. He had never realized how much she suffered in silence, how much she felt like a weight in his life. "All right," Richard finally said, his voice choked. "But if anything goes wrong, any sign of pain, you stop immediately." Jake nodded seriously and positioned himself beside the wheelchair. With gentle movements, he held Mrs. Margaret's right foot. "Mrs. Margaret, I want you to imagine you're stepping on the beach sand where you played as a child. Feel the sand between your toes. Now just wiggle your big toe like you're making a little hole in the sand." Mrs. Margaret closed her eyes and tried to follow the boy's instructions. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then, almost imperceptibly, her big toe moved. "You did it," Jake whispered excitedly, with genuine joy. "You did it!" Richard was stunned. For years, doctors had tried to get his mother to move any part of her legs, without success, and now, a street kid had done it in just minutes. "That can't be," Richard murmured. "How is this possible? Mum, how are you feeling?" he asked, kneeling beside the chair. "I felt a strange tingling in my leg," Mrs. Margaret answered, her eyes still closed. "And for the first time in 5 years, I didn't feel that terrible pain when I tried to move." Jake smiled and stepped back slightly. "That's enough for today. Tomorrow we can try another exercise if you'd like." "Wait," Richard called as the boy started to walk away. "Where are you sleeping tonight?" "Right here in the square under that bench." Jake pointed to a wooden bench in the center. "And food?" "Oh, something always turns up. Don't worry about me, Mr. Mitchell." Richard looked at the skinny boy in tattered clothes, who had just given his mother more hope in 5 minutes than the best doctors had in 5 years. "Jake," he called again, "tomorrow if you want, you can come to our house. My mom will be there and you can try some other exercises." "Are you sure, Mr. Mitchell?" Jake asked, genuinely surprised. "I am, and I'm also sure you'll have dinner with us tonight." During dinner that evening at the Mitchells' mansion in the upscale neighborhood of Portland, Jake told his story. He had lost his parents as a baby and was raised by his grandmother, Mrs. Beatrice, who worked as a housekeeper for a wealthy family. "When my grandmother got sick and couldn't work anymore, we had to leave the house we lived in at the back of the property. That's when we started living on the streets," Jake said, eating slowly, as if every bite were precious. "And after your grandmother passed," Mrs. Margaret asked gently, "I was alone, but she taught me that whenever we're suffering, someone else is suffering more, and that helping others is the best way to heal our own pain." Richard watched the boy eat and felt a lump in his throat. Here he was, a successful businessman, owner of a construction company making millions a year, and an orphaned street kid was teaching him life lessons. "Jake, why do you want to help my mother?" Richard asked directly. "Because she has the same eyes as my grandmother. Sad eyes, but with a will to live still shining deep inside." In the following days, Jake began visiting the Mitchells' house every day. He had created a routine of simple exercises for Mrs. Margaret, always based on fond memories and positive visualizations. "Now imagine you're in the kitchen making brigadeiro for your Richard when he was a little boy," Jake said during a session, gently manipulating Mrs. Margaret's right leg. "Smell the chocolate, the joy of making something sweet for someone you love." And it worked. Each day Mrs. Margaret could move her legs a little more, first her big toe, then all her toes, then her ankle, and gradually she began feeling sensation return to areas that had been numb for years. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. During the 3rd week of exercises, something went wrong. "Ow! Stop! Stop!" Mrs. Margaret cried out during an exercise, her face twisted in pain. Richard, who had been in the home office handling company matters, rushed into the room and found his mother in tears and Jake standing still, his hands trembling. "What happened here?" Richard asked, looking back and forth between his mother and the boy. I pushed too hard," Jake stammered. "I thought she was ready to bend her knee, but—" "Enough," Richard snapped. "I knew this would go wrong. You're just a kid. How could I let you play with my mother's health? Richard, don't yell at the boy, but Mrs. Margaret said through her tears. It wasn't his fault. Of course it was his fault, Richard kept shouting. He has no training. He's not a doctor. He doesn't know what he's doing. Jake lowered his head, his eyes wet. I'm sorry, Mrs. Margaret. I'm sorry, Mr. Richard. I just wanted to help. You've done enough, Richard said coldly. I think it's best if you don't come back here anymore. Jake nodded silently and headed for the door. Before leaving, he turned one last time. Mrs. Margaret, don't give up, okay? What happened today was a stumble, not the end. After the boy left, Richard immediately called the family doctor. Dr. Anderson examined Mrs. Margaret and concluded there was no serious damage, just a mild muscle strain from overexertion. Richard, maybe the boy has a point, Dr. Anderson said while writing a prescription for pain relief. Your mother has shown more progress in these 3 weeks than in 5 years of traditional physical therapy. Doctor, how can you say that? She could have been seriously hurt today. But she wasn't, and look, Dr. Anderson pointed to Mrs. Margaret's legs. Muscle tone is returning. Her legs aren't completely atrophied anymore. Richard shook his head, still upset about the whole situation. In the following days, the house felt strangely quiet. Mrs. Margaret tried doing the exercises on her own, but without Jake's guidance and encouragement, she quickly lost motivation. Mom, the doctor said you're getting better. Why won't you keep trying? Richard asked during breakfast. It's not the same, son. Jake had a special way of making me believe it was possible. Mom, he's just a street kid. He has no education, no idea what he's doing. Mrs. Margaret looked at her son with an expression he'd never seen before, a mix of disappointment and deep sadness. Richard, you're wrong. That boy knows exactly what he's doing. He knows how to heal the heart, and the heart is what commands the body. 3 days later, Richard came home early from work and found a scene that left him stunned. His mother was in the living room out of her wheelchair, sitting on the couch, and Jake was there, patiently helping her with the exercises. How did you get in here? Richard asked, trying to control his anger. I let him in, a voice said behind him. It was Betty, the housekeeper who had worked there for over 15 years. Betty, how dare you disobey my orders? Richard turned to the woman who had raised him since he was a child. Because Mrs. Margaret asked me to, Betty replied firmly, and because I see she's happy for the first time in 5 years. Richard looked at his mother, and indeed there was something different in her eyes, a light he hadn't seen in a long time. Son, sit here, Mrs. Margaret said, patting the couch beside her. We need to talk. Richard sat reluctantly, still casting suspicious glances at Jake. Richard, these past 5 years I gave up on living, Mrs. Margaret began. I woke up every day thinking I was a burden to you, that my life had no meaning left. Mom, don't say that. Let me finish, she interrupted. Jake showed me the problem wasn't in my legs, it was in my head, in my heart. I stopped wanting to walk not because I couldn't, but because I was afraid. Afraid of what? Afraid of falling again, afraid of disappointing you, afraid of trying and failing. Richard felt a tightness in his chest. He'd never realized how much his mother had been suffering emotionally. And Jake taught me that falling is part of the process of walking, that we only truly fail when we stop trying. During the conversation, Jake stayed silent, but Richard could feel the boy's gaze on him. Jake, Richard finally said, turning to him. Why did you keep coming here even after I told you not to? Because Mrs. Margaret needs me, Jake answered simply. And because I promised my grandmother I'd help. But you refused money, food, everything I offered you. Why? Jake hesitated before answering. Because when someone gives you something out of pity, it makes you feel even smaller. But when someone needs you, when you're useful, then you feel human again. Those words struck Richard like lightning. He finally understood it wasn't charity Jake wanted, it was purpose. Jake, I'm sorry for yelling at you, and for sending you away, Richard said, weighed down by guilt. You can keep coming here. In fact, I want you to live here. Jake shook his head. Thank you, Mr. Mitchell, but I can't. There are other people on the streets who need help too. If I stay only here, how will I help them? In the months that followed, a routine was set. Jake came every morning to do exercises with Mrs. Margaret, and every afternoon he returned to the streets to care for others in need. Richard began joining some sessions and was amazed by the dedication and knowledge the boy had gained from watching professionals at Mercy General Hospital. "Jake, how do you remember all these exercises?" Richard asked during one session. "When you have nothing, your memory becomes your treasure," Jake replied. "I memorized every movement, every word the physical therapist said, because I knew one day I'd need to use them." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. Mrs. Margaret's progress was slow but steady. She could already stand for a few minutes with the support of a cane and had regained much of the feeling in her legs. But Richard was beginning to notice something that deeply troubled him. The more his mother improved, the more he became aware of his own absence during all those years. "Mum, can I ask you something?" Richard said during dinner. "Of course, son. When you fell that day, I was away on a business trip, right?" Mrs. Margaret lowered her eyes and nodded. "Why didn't you call me right away?" "I did, son. You were in an important meeting and said you'd call me back. When you did, it was already late at night and I was already at the hospital." Richard felt a heavy weight in his chest. He had put work before his mother when she needed him most. "Mom, forgive me. I should have dropped everything and come running." "Richard, you don't have to apologize. You were building your future." "But I sacrificed our present," Richard said, his voice choked. "And the worst part is, I kept doing it even after the accident. How many times did I leave you alone here while I was handling business?" Jake, who was helping Betty clear the table, stopped and looked at Richard. "Mr. Mitchell, can I say something?" Richard nodded. "Mrs. Margaret doesn't need you to blame yourself for the past. She needs you to be there in the future." Once again, that 13-year-old boy showed a wisdom that shamed Richard. "Jake is right," Mrs. Margaret said. "I don't want your apologies, son. I want your company." That night, Richard made a decision that would change his life forever. He began delegating more responsibilities at the company and working from home whenever possible so he could be there for his mother's recovery. But the challenges were just beginning. One Thursday morning, Richard arrived at the exercise room and found Jake whispering to Mrs. Margaret, who was crying. "What happened here?" Richard asked, quickly approaching. "Mrs. Margaret is discouraged because progress is too slow," Jake explained. "She thinks she'll never really walk again." "Mum, but you've already improved so much." "It's not enough, Richard," Mrs. Margaret said through tears. "I want to be able to walk to you when you come home. I want to cook standing up. I want to climb the stairs and see my room again." Richard realized his mother had specific dreams, not just a vague desire to get better. "And why can't you do those things?" Jake asked gently. "Because I'm afraid," Mrs. Margaret confessed. "Afraid to take a real step and fall. Afraid to find out it might never be possible." Jake knelt beside the wheelchair and held Mrs. Margaret's hands. "Mrs. Margaret, can I tell you something about my grandma?" She nodded. In her last month, she grew very weak, but there was one day she always tried to get out of bed, even knowing she might fall. "What day was that?" "The day I came home. She wanted to greet me standing up, like a real grandma. And you know what happened?" "What?" "Sometimes she managed, sometimes she fell, but she always tried. And on the days she succeeded, her smile lit up the whole house." Mrs. Margaret thought about the boy's words. "Jake, do you think I can stand without support?" "I think you can try. And by trying, we find out what we're capable of." "Richard," Mrs. Margaret turned to her son, "I want to try to stand on my own. Mom, what if you fall?" "Then I fall, but at least I'll have tried." With great care, Jake and Richard positioned themselves on either side of Mrs. Margaret. She placed her hands on the arms of the wheelchair and slowly began to rise. Her legs trembled violently, and for a moment it seemed she would fall. But then something extraordinary happened. She found her balance and stood on her own for a few seconds. "Mom, you did it!" Richard shouted, tears in his eyes. "I did," Mrs. Margaret said, a mix of surprise and joy in her voice. "I really did. But the joy was short-lived. The effort had been too great, and Mrs. Margaret felt a wave of dizziness. Her legs gave out, and she began to fall. Richard and Jake quickly caught her, but the scare was real. "Mom, how are you?" "I'm fine," she answered, breathless. "I'm fine, and I'm happy. For the first time in 5 years, I stood on my own." That evening at dinner, Mrs. Margaret was radiant. She had proved to herself that it was possible. "Jake, tomorrow I want to try taking a step," she said with determination. "Mrs. Margaret, let's take it slow. Today was a big step forward, but—" "No, Jake, I want to try. If I could stand today, I can try walking tomorrow." Richard watched the conversation with mixed feelings. He was happy for his mother's progress, but worried she might push herself too hard and get hurt. The next morning, Jake arrived earlier than usual. He looked concerned. "Mr. Mitchell, I think Mrs. Margaret is too eager. Maybe we should go slower." "Jake, my mother is a determined woman. Once she sets her mind to something, nothing changes it." "But what if she gets hurt trying to walk? What if she falls and gives up for good?" Richard realized Jake genuinely cared about his mother's well-being, and it touched him deeply. "Jake, you really care about her, don't you?" "Of course I do. Mrs. Margaret is like a grandmother to me now, the family I thought I'd never have again." Those words moved Richard. He no longer saw Jake just as someone helping his mother. He saw him as family. "Then here's what we'll do," Richard said. "We'll let her try, but with all possible care. And if it goes wrong, we'll handle the consequences together." When Mrs. Margaret came down to the exercise room, there was a determination in her eyes Richard hadn't seen in years. "Good morning, my two favorite men," she said cheerfully. "Ready to see me walk? Mom, are you sure you want to try today?" "Absolutely. Jake, help me up." With extreme care, Jake helped Mrs. Margaret rise from the wheelchair. She stood, trembling slightly, but steadier than the day before. "Now I want both of you to step aside," she said firmly. "Mom, that's dangerous. What if you fall?" "Richard, if I fall, I'll get up, but I need to try on my own." Reluctantly, Richard and Jake moved back but stayed close enough to intervene if needed. Mrs. Margaret took a deep breath, looked toward the sofa about 3 feet away, and took her first step. Her body swayed dangerously, but she didn't fall. Then came the second step, then the third. "Mom, you're walking!" Richard cried, unable to contain his emotion. "I'm walking," Mrs. Margaret repeated, as if she couldn't believe her own words. "I'm really walking." She made it to the sofa and sat down, exhausted but glowing with happiness. "Jake, thank you," she said, opening her arms to the boy. "Thank you for teaching me I could still dream." Richard watched the scene with a tightness in his chest. His mother had just walked on her own for the first time in 5 years, and it had been made possible thanks to a street kid he had initially rejected. In the following days, the news spread through the neighborhood. Mrs. Margaret, who was known and loved by everyone, had started walking again. People came to visit her to see the miracle with their own eyes. "Mrs. Margaret, how did you manage it?" asked Mrs. Mary, a long-time neighbor. "It was Jake," Mrs. Margaret always replied. "He taught me that the body only walks when the heart decides to move." Richard watched as his mother credited Jake for her recovery, and it made him reflect on his own life. "Jake," he said one afternoon when the two were outside the house, "can I ask you a personal question?" "Of course, Mr. Mitchell." "Don't you feel angry at your parents for abandoning you, or at life for being so hard on you?" Jake thought for a moment before answering. "I used to, especially when I saw other kids with their families, but my grandmother taught me that anger is like carrying a heavy stone in your backpack. The longer you carry it, the heavier it gets." "And how did you stop carrying that stone?" "By finding a purpose bigger than my pain. When I help someone like Mrs. Margaret, I feel like my grandmother is proud of me, and that's worth more than any anger I could feel." Richard fell silent, processing the boy's words. "Jake, you teach me things I should have learned a long time ago." "Everyone learns in their own time, Mr. Mitchell. What matters is not stopping the learning." That week, Richard made an important decision. He wanted to formalize Jake's situation and ensure the boy had access to education and a better life. "Jake, I want you to come live with us for good," Richard said during dinner. "Mr. Mitchell, I already told you I can't. There are so many people on the streets who need help. What if I told you you could keep helping those people, but have a safe place to sleep and study?" Jake hesitated. "What do you mean?" "I'm thinking of starting a project. A place where people like you can teach what they know to those in need. You could study and help others at the same time." "Is that even possible?" "With dedication and planning, anything is possible. You taught me that yourself." Mrs. Margaret clapped her hands in joy. "Richard, what a wonderful idea. Jake, would you agree?" Jake looked at the two people who had become his family and nodded slowly. "But on one condition," he said. "What?" "I want the other street kids to have a chance to join too, and I want us to help not just people who can't walk, but elderly folks who are alone and abandoned." Richard smiled. Once again, Jake was thinking of others before himself. "Deal. We'll create this project together." In the following months, Richard sold part of his shares in the construction company to fund the project. They turned part of the mansion into a community space where at-risk youth could learn and teach at the same time. The project grew quickly. Jake not only helped people regain physical movement, but also worked with elderly people suffering from loneliness and depression. "Jake, how do you always know exactly what to say to each person?" Richard asked one afternoon after watching the boy talk to Mr. Anthony, an 80-year-old man who had been depressed since losing his wife. "Because I've felt all the pain they're feeling," Jake replied. "When you've been through a lot of bad things, it's easier to understand others' pain." The project was going well, but Richard had no idea the biggest challenge was yet to come. On a Tuesday morning, when Richard arrived at the common area, he found Jake talking to an elegant, well-dressed woman he didn't recognize. "Richard, this is the Jake I told you about," the woman said, standing up and extending her hand. "I'm Dr. Catherine, the social worker." Richard felt a shiver run down his spine. "How can I help you?" "I received a report that there's a minor working here without proper documentation or supervision. I need to verify Jake's legal status." Richard looked at Jake, who had gone pale. "Doctor, Catherine, Jake isn't working. He's participating in a social project we created. Mr. Mitchell, I understand your good intentions, but there are protocols that must be followed when it comes to minors in vulnerable situations. Jake needs to be under the legal guardianship of someone or in an appropriate institution." "But he's fine here with us," Richard protested. "That isn't your decision to make. It's up to the courts." Jake stepped closer to Richard. "Mr. Mitchell, it's okay. I always knew this might happen someday." "No," Richard exclaimed. "Jake, you're part of our family now. We'll figure this out." Dr. Catherine explained that Jake would have to go to a temporary shelter while the adoption or guardianship process was reviewed. "How long could that take?" Richard asked. "A few months, maybe a year. It depends on several factors." Richard felt his world crumbling. Not only would Jake be taken away, but the entire project they had built together was now at risk. "Can I say goodbye to Mrs. Margaret?" Jake asked, his voice trembling. "Of course, but quickly." When Mrs. Margaret heard the news, she was inconsolable. "You can't take my grandson," she sobbed, clutching Jake's hands. "He taught me how to walk again, gave me back my will to live. Mrs. Margaret, promise me you won't stop walking, okay? Promise me you'll keep doing the exercises." "Jake, I promise. But you promise you'll come back?" "I promise I'll try." Richard walked Jake to the social services car, feeling utterly powerless. "Jake, I'll do everything I can to bring you back. Everything. Mr. Mitchell, thank you for everything. You and Mrs. Margaret gave me the family I always dreamed of." The car drove off, taking Jake away, and Richard stood frozen on the sidewalk, watching until it disappeared into the distance. In the days that followed, the house grew somber. Mrs. Margaret lost much of her motivation to keep up with her exercises, and Richard threw himself into a legal battle to gain custody of Jake. "Mr. Williams," Richard said to his lawyer, "how long will this process take?" "Richard, honestly, it's going to be tough. You're single, you work long hours, and the courts prefer established families or couples for adoption. But Jake doesn't want to be adopted by strangers. He wants to stay with us. I understand, but the law is clear. We'll do what we can, but you need to prepare for the possibility that this won't work out. Richard wasn't willing to accept that answer. He began using every contact and resource he had to speed up the process and find a solution. Meanwhile, Jake was in a shelter in the neighboring town, a large, impersonal institution where he felt lost and alone. "Jake, why don't you play with the other kids?" asked Marcy, one of the shelter's caregivers. "I don't feel like it," Jake replied, staring out the window toward Portland. "Are you homesick?" "I miss my family." Jake had started closing himself off, losing the spark in his eyes that had always defined him. Back in Portland, Mrs. Margaret was going through the hardest days since her accident. Without Jake's presence, she had lost much of her drive to keep exercising. "Mum, you need to keep trying to walk," Richard said during breakfast. "Why, son? Jake isn't here to see my progress. But you're walking for yourself, not just for him." "Richard, you don't understand. Jake gave me a reason to want to walk. Without him here, I feel lost again." Richard realized the connection between Jake and his mother went far beyond physical exercises. It was a deep emotional bond that had given meaning to both their lives. That night, Richard made a decision. He would visit Jake at the shelter, even if it might complicate the legal process. "Jake!" Richard called out when he saw the boy in the shelter's courtyard. Jake ran toward him and threw himself into his arms, crying, "Mr. Mitchell, I thought you'd forgotten about me." "Never, Jake, never. How are you?" "Sad, really sad. No one here needs me. I'm no use to anyone here." Richard's heart broke seeing Jake so dejected. "Jake, listen carefully. You're getting out of here. I'll do whatever it takes. But you're coming home." "Are you sure?" "Absolutely. And until then, I want you to keep being who you are. Keep helping people here. Stay kind. Stay special. But what if I never get to come back?" "You will. I promise." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now back to the story. When Richard returned home and told Mrs. Margaret about his visit to Jake, she made a decision that surprised everyone. "Richard, I want to visit Jake too." "Mom, the shelter is far and you're not steady enough for a long trip yet." "Son, I walked when I wanted to surprise Jake. Now I'll walk to go to him." Richard realized his mother had found new motivation to keep exercising. Over the following days, Mrs. Margaret pushed herself harder, determined to get strong enough to visit Jake. Richard watched in awe as her love for the boy gave her renewed strength. A week later, they made the trip to the shelter. When Jake saw Mrs. Margaret walking toward him, leaning only on a cane, his eyes filled with tears. "Mrs. Margaret, you came all this way." "Of course I did, my dear boy. Did you think I'd abandon you?" Jake threw himself into Mrs. Margaret's arms and they both cried. "Mrs. Margaret, you're walking so well." "That's because I have a reason to walk now, visiting you." During the visit, Richard noticed how Jake became himself again in Mrs. Margaret's presence. The boy introduced her to all the shelter's children, talked about how he tried to help the younger ones, and showed her some drawings he'd made. "Jake, you haven't lost who you are," Richard said as they were leaving. "Keep being this wonderful person, and soon you'll be home with us." The visit lifted Jake's spirits, but it also strengthened Richard's resolve to speed up the legal process. "Mr. Williams, there has to be a faster way," Richard told the lawyer. "Jake is wasting away in that place." "Richard, there is one possibility, but it's risky." "What is it?" "You could get married. The courts look more favorably on couples who want to adopt." "Doctor, I won't marry for convenience. That would be wrong for me and any woman." "Then we'll proceed the usual way. But you'll need to be patient." Richard left the lawyer's office frustrated. He had money, influence, connections, yet none of it seemed to speed up a process that was keeping his family apart. That night at dinner, Betty made an observation that caught Richard's attention. "Mr. Mitchell, don't you think it's strange that someone filed a complaint just when the project was going so well?" What do you mean, Betty? Who reported it? Why now? Who had a problem with Jake's work? Richard had never considered that. Who would want to separate Jake from his family? Betty, you're right. This wasn't a coincidence. Mr. Mitchell, can you think of anyone who might have taken issue with the project? Richard began to reflect. The project had gained attention in Portland, been featured in the local newspaper, and changed the dynamics of the upscale neighborhood where they lived. The neighbors, Richard said suddenly. Some neighbors complained when we started welcoming people from other social classes into our home. Exactly. And who has the influence to file a complaint that would be taken seriously? Richard felt anger rising inside him. The possibility that Jake had been removed because of prejudice and intolerance infuriated him. The next day, Richard went to speak with Mr. Thompson, the neighbor who had been the most vocal in his complaints about the project. Mr. Thompson, did you file a complaint about the boy working in my home? Richard, I didn't file any complaint. I just mentioned to a few people that I thought it was inappropriate for a minor to be working unsupervised. Who did you mention it to? To Dr. Jennifer, my daughter-in-law. She works at City Hall in the Social Services Department. Richard felt the pieces falling into place. The complaint hadn't been anonymous. It had been orchestrated by people who were bothered by Jake's and the other children's presence in the neighborhood. Mr. Thompson, that boy wasn't working. He was studying and helping others. He changed my mother's life. Richard, I understand your good intentions, but you need to see our concern. The neighborhood is changing. There are unfamiliar people around. Unfamiliar people, Richard interrupted. They're people who need help, not criminals. But how can we be sure? Richard realized he was dealing with deep-seated prejudice and ignorance, and it only strengthened his resolve to bring Jake back. That afternoon, Richard went to City Hall to speak with Dr. Jennifer. Dr. Jennifer, I'd like to understand the complaint filed about Jake. Mr. Mitchell, it was a legitimate report about a minor in an irregular situation. Irregular how? He was well cared for, studying, helping others. But he wasn't under legal guardianship. That's irregular. And who exactly filed the complaint? Dr. Jennifer hesitated. Complaints are confidential. Dr. Jennifer, I know it was you, and I know it was motivated by prejudice, not concern for Jake's well-being. Mr. Mitchell, I was just doing my professional duty. Your duty is to protect children, not separate them from families who love them. Richard left City Hall more determined than ever. If prejudice had taken Jake from his home, he would use every resource he had to fight that prejudice. That night, Richard called every journalist he knew and told the full story, how Jake had helped his mother walk again, how they'd built a successful social project, and how it had all been destroyed by a complaint rooted in bias. Richard, this is a powerful story, said Susan, a reporter for the region's leading newspaper. Can I write a piece about it? You can, and you should. People need to know what really happened. The article was published the following Sunday under the headline, Street Kid Who Taught Businessman About Love is Separated from Family by Prejudice. The response was immediate. Hundreds of people called Richard offering support, sharing similar stories, and demanding Jake's return to his family. Mr. Richard, the company secretary came to see you on Monday. There's a line of journalists wanting to interview you about Jake's story. Schedule interviews with all of them. The more people know the truth, the better. During the interviews, Richard was questioned about his motivations. Mr. Mitchell, why is it so important for you to bring this boy back? Because Jake isn't just a street kid we helped. He's the person who saved my family. He taught my mother to walk again, taught me to be a better son, and showed us that love knows no social class. And what's your message to the people who made the complaint? That they missed the chance to know one of the most special people who ever lived, and that their prejudice robbed our city of a project that was changing lives. The pressure of public opinion began to take effect. The judge overseeing the case scheduled a hearing to reevaluate Jake's situation. Mr. Williams, do you think we have a chance? Richard asked the lawyer. With all this positive attention, our odds have improved a lot, but it's still not a guarantee. And if the judge rules against us, then Jake will go up for adoption, and you won't be able to see him anymore. Richard felt a chill. The thought of losing Jake forever terrified him. The week of the hearing, Richard received an unexpected call. "Mr. Mitchell, this is Marcy from the shelter where Jake is staying." "Marcy, has something happened to him?" "No, but I need to talk to you. Jake is very depressed. He barely eats, doesn't play with the other kids, and yesterday I found him crying in his room. Can I talk to him?" "He doesn't want to speak on the phone, but he asked me to give you a message." "What message?" "He said that if he can't come home, he wants you and Mrs. Margaret to be happy anyway, and that you shouldn't blame yourselves for anything." Tears welled up in Richard's eyes. Even in his pain, Jake was worried about their well-being. "Marcy, tell him we're coming for him, that he mustn't give up." "I'll tell him, Mr. Mitchell, but he needs you. This separation is destroying him inside." On the day of the hearing, Richard wore his best suit and brought Mrs. Margaret, who insisted on walking in with her cane. "Mum, are you sure you want to be at the hearing?" "Absolutely. Jake needs to see that I'm fighting for him too." The courtroom was full. Besides Richard and Mrs. Margaret, there were journalists, neighbors supporting the family, and even some children and seniors who had benefited from the project Jake helped create. When Jake entered the room escorted by Marcy, Richard's heart ached. The boy was visibly thinner and sadder, but his eyes lit up when he saw Richard and Mrs. Margaret. "Jake, how are you?" Mrs. Margaret asked as he approached. "Better now that I see you," Jake replied, hugging her. The judge, Judge William Parker, was a man around 60, with a stern but not hostile expression. "Let's begin this hearing," he said. "Mr. Mitchell, can you explain your relationship with the minor Jake and why you seek custody?" Richard stood, took a deep breath, and began recounting the story from their first meeting in the square. "Your Honor, Jake isn't just a child we took in. He's the person who saved my family. My mother hadn't walked in 5 years, and he did what the best doctors couldn't. He made her want to walk again." Richard spoke about the community project, the changes Jake had brought to their lives, and how the separation was affecting them all. "And what is your financial and family situation, Mr. Mitchell?" the judge asked. "I'm a successful businessman. I can provide education, healthcare, and love for Jake. And he'd have my mother as his grandmother, a stable family environment." "And what about you, Jake?" the judge addressed the boy. "What do you want?" Jake stood up, his voice trembling. "Your Honor, I want to go home. Mr. Richard and Mrs. Margaret are my family. They love me and I love them. And if I decide you should be adopted by a family with both a father and a mother, then I'll accept it, because I know they'll still be happy. But my heart will always be with them." Mrs. Margaret rose, leaning on her cane. "Your Honor, may I speak?" "Of course, ma'am. I couldn't walk for 5 years. Jake taught me that it wasn't enough for my body to function if my heart had no reason to walk. He gave me that reason. He gave me back the joy of living. If you take him away, I don't know if I'll be able to keep walking." The judge watched Mrs. Margaret standing, supported only by a cane, and seemed impressed. "Ma'am, you truly couldn't walk?" 5 years in a wheelchair, Your Honor. Jake healed my body by first healing my soul. Then Dr. Catherine, the social worker, was called to give her opinion. Your Honor, while I recognize the emotional bond between the parties, I still have concerns about the suitability of the environment. Mr. Mitchell is single, works long hours, and... Dr. Catherine, the judge interrupted. What matters more, following protocol or ensuring the child's well-being? The well-being, of course. And from what I see here, this child is suffering away from this family, and this family is suffering away from this child. Doesn't that indicate where the child's best interest lies? Dr. Catherine hesitated. Your Honor, perhaps we could establish a supervised adjustment period. No, the judge said firmly. I've seen enough. Richard felt his heart stop. Was the judge going to rule against them? Jake, the judge called the boy again. Come here. Jake approached, trembling. Jake, are you absolutely certain you want to stay with Mr. Mitchell and Mrs. Margaret? Yes, sir, I am. And you, Mr. Mitchell, are you certain you want the responsibility of raising this boy? Absolutely, Your Honor. The judge fell silent for a few minutes, observing everyone in the room. In 30 years on the bench, he finally said, I've learned that family isn't defined by blood or official roles. Family is defined by love, care, and mutual commitment. Richard felt hope swelling in his chest. It's clear to me that Jake, Mr. Mitchell, and Mrs. Margaret form a real and functional family. It's also clear that separation is causing unnecessary suffering for everyone involved. The judge turned to Dr. Catherine. Dr. Catherine, the complaint that led to this case was motivated by prejudice, not legitimate concern for the child's well-being. This should serve as a lesson in how prejudice can destroy lives. Richard could barely breathe from anxiety. Therefore, the judge continued, I grant temporary custody of Jake to Mr. Richard Mitchell with minimal supervision from social services. In 6 months, we'll reassess the situation to decide on permanent adoption. The room erupted in applause. Jake ran to Richard and Mrs. Margaret, and the three hugged, crying with joy. Jake, you're going home, Richard said, holding the boy tightly. We did it, my grandson, Mrs. Margaret said, kissing Jake's forehead. Our family is together again. As they left the courtroom, Jake turned to the judge. Your Honor, thank you so much for letting me stay with my family. Jake, thank you for showing me there are still people like you in the world. The drive home was a celebration. Richard drove, Mrs. Margaret sat in the passenger seat, and Jake was in the back, all talking at once, planning their future. Jake, the first thing we'll do is restart the project, Richard said. Mr. Mitchell, what if more complaints come up? Now we have the law on our side, and we have the community's support. No one will ever separate us again. When they arrived home, Betty was waiting at the door with a chocolate cake and welcome back banners. Jake, she shouted, running to hug the boy. I missed you so much. Betty, thank you for taking care of Mrs. Margaret while I was away. Jake, Mrs. Margaret was sad, but she never lost hope. She always said you'd come back. That evening, during the celebration dinner, Richard raised a toast. Jake, you came into our lives like an angel disguised as a street kid. You taught my mother to walk again, taught me to be a better person, and showed us that family is so much more than blood. Mr. Mitchell, you're the ones who taught me what a real family is. For the first time in my life, I know what it feels like to belong somewhere. Mrs. Margaret lifted her glass. Jake, thank you for teaching me it's never too late to start over. You gave me a second chance at life. In the months that followed, the lives of the three settled into a new routine. Jake returned to school, now enrolled in a private institution, but still dedicated his afternoons to the social project they had created. The project grew and became a model for the area. At-risk youth came to learn from Jake and other volunteers, while lonely seniors found companionship and purpose. Jake, how do you balance school and the project? Richard asked one afternoon. It's easy when you love what you do. The project gives me energy to study. It doesn't tire me out. And your plans for the future? I want to study physical therapy. I want to learn scientifically what I've picked up by observation, so I can help even more people. Richard smiled, proud of the boy who had become his son in every way that mattered. Mrs. Margaret's transformation continued to amaze everyone. Not only had she regained her ability to walk, but she had become one of the project's most active volunteers. Mrs. Margaret, don't you get tired helping so many people? Asked Mrs. Rose, a 75-year-old woman who had arrived at the project, depressed and alone. Rose, dear, when you find purpose in life, you don't get tired. You get energized. And what's your purpose? To help others discover it's never too late to start over. If I could walk again at 68 after 5 years in a wheelchair, anyone can overcome any obstacle. The project was changing not just the lives of its participants, but the entire dynamic of the neighborhood. Neighbors who once complained about people from different social classes now volunteered to help. Mr. Mitchell, Mr. Thompson, the neighbor who had indirectly contributed to the complaint against Jake, appeared at their door one Saturday. Can I talk to you? Of course, Mr. Thompson, come in. I want to apologize. I was wrong about Jake and the project. Seeing what you've built, I realize my prejudice blinded me to something beautiful. Mr. Thompson, no apology needed. What matters is that you understand now. And I'd like to know if I can help in some way. My wife is a retired nurse and she'd like to volunteer a few hours a week. Richard smiled. Mr. Thompson's change of heart was further proof of how Jake's love and dedication were transforming the entire community. 6 months after the hearing, they returned to court for the final evaluation of Jake's adoption. "How are things at home?" asked Judge Parker. "Better than I ever imagined, Your Honor," Richard replied. "Jake is doing well in school, the social project is thriving, and we've become a real family. And you, Jake, are you happy?" "So happy, Judge. I have a family who loves me, I'm studying, and I get to keep helping others." "Mrs. Margaret, how do you feel about being Jake's official grandmother now?" "It's the best thing that's happened to me since learning to walk again. Jake didn't just give me back the use of my legs, he gave me back the joy of living." The judge smiled. "Well then, I see no reason for further delays. I grant Richard Mitchell's petition for Jake's full adoption. Congratulations to the new official family." Once again, the room filled with applause, but this time the emotion was even greater. Jake now had a full name, Jake Mitchell. He had an official family, a home, and a guaranteed future. "Jake," Richard said as they left the courthouse, "now you're officially my son." "And you're officially my dad," Jake replied, hugging Richard. "Thank you for never giving up on me." 2 years later, the project had become a recognized institution in the city. Jake, now 15, was the youth ambassador for Steps of Hope and gave talks at schools about overcoming adversity and solidarity. "Jake, how do you explain your success to other kids?" a journalist asked during an interview. "I tell them success isn't about having lots of money or being famous. Success is finding people who love you and finding a way to help others. When you have that, you have everything." "And what's your advice for kids going through hard times?" "Never stop dreaming and always look for ways to help someone. When you help others, you discover your own strength." Richard watched Jake's interviews with immense pride. The thin, sad boy he'd found in the square had grown into a thoughtful, caring young man determined to make a difference in the world. Mrs. Margaret, now 70, had become a role model for senior fitness. She taught exercise classes at the community center and always shared her story to motivate others. "Mrs. Margaret, what's your secret for staying active at your age?" a new student asked. "The secret is having a reason to move. When you have people you love and purposes that inspire you, your body follows your heart's will." "And were you ever afraid of falling again?" "Of course I was. But I learned that the fear of falling is smaller than the joy of walking. And even if I do fall, there'll always be someone to help me back up." On the project's 3rd anniversary, they threw a big celebration in the square where it all began. Hundreds came, seniors who'd regained their confidence, young people who'd found direction, families who'd reconnected. "Jake," Richard said during his opening speech, 3 years ago, you were a homeless boy sleeping under benches. Today, you're a young man, inspiring hundreds and changing a whole community." "Mr. Mitchell," Jake replied at the microphone, 3 years ago you were a wealthy but lonely businessman who drifted apart from your own mother. Today, you're a proud father and a man who dedicates his life to helping others." Richard felt tears welling up. "Jake, you taught me that real wealth isn't in what we gain, but in what we give, and that family isn't about blood, it's about love." The celebration lasted late into the night, with music, dancing, and countless stories of resilience. But the most moving moment came when Mrs. Margaret stepped onto the makeshift stage. "I want to dance with my 2 favorite men," she said, reaching for Richard and Jake. They chose Bob Dylan's Forever Young, and the 3 danced at the center of the square, surrounded by the crowd's emotional applause. "Mrs. Margaret," Jake said during the song, "do you remember when you couldn't even wiggle your toe?" "I do, my boy. And I remember how you taught me that the first step is always the hardest, but it gets easier after that. And now you're dancing." "I'm dancing because I have reasons to dance. I have the 2 of you. I have our project. I have our family." Richard watched his mother dancing and remembered the day he found her crying in her wheelchair, feeling useless and hopeless. The transformation had been complete. She was no longer just a person who had learned to walk again, but someone who had found a new reason to live. At the end of the party, as they were cleaning up, Jake found a piece of paper on the floor. It was a drawing made by a child, showing 3 people, a man in a suit, a woman with a cane, and a boy. Underneath it said, "My dream family." "Mr. Richard, look at this." Jake showed him the drawing. "Whose is it?" I don't know, but I think it's from one of the kids at the party. And look what they wrote. Richard read the words, "My dream family," and felt his heart tighten. Jake, do you realize we've become the kind of family other kids wish they had? That's a big responsibility, isn't it? It is, but it's also the greatest honor we could have. That night, the three of them had dinner at home, tired but happy. Jake, Mrs. Margaret said, "You have a math test tomorrow, right?" "I do, Grandma, but I studied a lot." "And how are your grades?" "Really good. I want to keep my average high so I can get into a good physical therapy program." Richard smiled hearing Jake call Mrs. Margaret Grandma. It had been a natural transition, and now he couldn't imagine life any other way. "Jake, are you sure you want to study physical therapy?" Richard asked. "Absolutely. I want to study scientifically everything I've learned in practice. And I want to develop new treatment methods that consider not just the body but people's emotions too. That would be revolutionary in healthcare. That's exactly what I want, to change how we treat people who've lost hope of moving again." 2 years later, Jake was graduating high school as one of the top students in his class. He had been accepted into the best university in the region for physical therapy. During the ceremony, Richard and Mrs. Margaret sat in the audience, proud and emotional. "Richard," Mrs. Margaret whispered, "do you remember when we first found Jake in the square?" "How could I forget? It feels like yesterday and a lifetime ago at the same time. That thin, sad boy became this brilliant, determined young man, and we became a real family. When Jake stepped onto the stage to receive his diploma, he spoke briefly into the microphone. 'I want to dedicate this achievement to the two people who taught me that family is about love, not blood. Thank you, Dad. Thank you, Grandma. You didn't just give me a home, you gave me a reason to dream big.'" The audience applauded tearfully, and Richard felt it was one of the happiest moments of his life. After the ceremony, they held a small celebration at home, just for family and close friends. "Jake," Betty said as she served cake, "I still remember the first day you showed up here. Thin, scared, but with those bright eyes." "I remember too, Betty. I remember how warmly you all welcomed me, even though I was a stranger." "You were never a stranger," Mrs. Margaret said. "From the very first moment I knew you were special." "How did you know?" "Because you looked at me and saw not an invalid old woman, but someone who still had potential. Only a truly special person can do that." During the party, Richard got an unexpected call. "Mr. Richard, this is Judge William Parker, the judge who handled Jake's adoption case." "Judge Parker, what a surprise. How are you?" "Very well, thank you. I'm calling to congratulate you on Jake's graduation. I read about it in the paper. Judge, thank you so much. Jake is really happy." "Mr. Richard, I want you to know your case changed my perspective on family and adoption. Since then, I always prioritize emotional connection over bureaucratic protocols." "I'm glad to hear that, Doctor. And can I speak to Jake?" Richard called Jake to the phone. "Judge Parker," Jake said, surprised and happy. "Jake, congratulations on your graduation. You've become an exemplary young man." "Thank you, Doctor. You changed my life when you decided to let me stay with my family." "Jake, you actually changed mine. You taught me that true justice is about doing what's right, not blindly following rules." "Doctor, when I graduate from college, I want to invite you to the ceremony. It would be an honor to be there." After the call, Jake grew thoughtful. "Dad, it's funny to think how our story didn't just change our lives, but other people's lives too." "How so, son?" "Judge Parker said our case changed how he rules on adoption proceedings. How many other families have benefited from that?" Richard had never considered that. Their story had created ripples that spread far beyond what they imagined. "Jake, you're right. Sometimes we don't realize the impact our lives have on others. And that makes me think our responsibility is even greater. Everything we do can inspire or discourage others." During his college years, Jake excelled not only academically, but also in his innovative approach to physical therapy. He developed techniques that combined physical exercises with emotional work based on his own experience with Mrs. Margaret. "Jake," said Professor Susan, his internship advisor, "your approach is very different from traditional methods." "Professor, I learned that the body only moves when the mind wants to. If a person lacks emotional motivation to improve, no exercise will fully work. And how do you build that motivation? First, I listen to their story. I understand not just what happened physically, but what happened emotionally. Then, I help them find personal reasons to want to move again. That's very interesting. Have you thought about documenting these methods? Professor, my goal is to write a book about it after I graduate. I want other professionals to use these techniques. In his final year of college, Jake began writing his thesis on humanized physical therapy, the importance of emotional connection in physical recovery. The paper made a strong impression on the faculty and became a reference at the university. "Jake," said Dr. Charles, the program coordinator, "your work is exceptional. Have you considered pursuing a master's degree?" "Doctor, my dream is to open a clinic that combines traditional physical therapy with emotional support. I want it to be a place where people don't just come to exercise their bodies, but to heal their hearts too." "And do you have the resources for that?" "My dad will help me, and I plan for it to be a community clinic, serving people from all walks of life." Richard grew prouder and prouder of Jake's dreams. The boy wasn't just thinking of personal success, but of how he could help as many people as possible. "Jake," Richard said during dinner, "I'm preparing a surprise for your graduation." "What kind of surprise, Dad?" "I bought a plot of land near downtown. If you want, it could be the location for your future clinic." Jake was speechless for a moment. "Dad, you'd do that for me?" "Jake, you helped my mother walk again, taught me to be a better person, and transformed our family. It's the least I can do to repay you. But it must have cost so much money." "Jake, money is just money. But the chance to help you fulfill your dream of helping others, that's priceless." Mrs. Margaret, who had been listening, stood up and hugged them both. "My two wonderful men. You make me so proud. Grandma, without you, none of this would be possible. You were my first patient, my inspiration, my family. Jake, you're the one who gave me a second chance at life. Now, seeing you ready to give that same chance to others, it's the most beautiful gift I could ever receive." On the day of his college graduation, the ceremony was even more emotional than his high school one. Jake was graduating with highest honors and already had clear plans for the future. "Jake Mitchell," the dean called his name to receive his diploma. When Jake walked onto the stage, Richard and Mrs. Margaret were in the front row crying with pride. Also present were Betty, Judge Parker, who made sure to attend, and dozens of people who had been touched by the social project Jake helped create. "Thank you," Jake said into the microphone, "to everyone who was part of this journey, especially my family, who taught me that love can overcome any obstacle. As a physical therapist, I promise to dedicate my life to helping people rediscover their ability to move, both physically and emotionally." The audience erupted in applause, and Richard felt this was the closing of one chapter and the beginning of an even more promising one. After the graduation, they held a celebration at the clinic that was still under construction. The building wasn't finished yet, but you could already see what it would become. A spacious, bright place with indoor gardens and a welcoming atmosphere. "Jake," said Susan, the journalist who had helped share their story years earlier, "can I interview you about your plans for the clinic? Of course, the idea is to create a space where physical therapy is more than just exercises. We want to treat the whole person, body, mind, and heart." "And how would that work in practice?" "Each patient would have not just a physical therapist, but also psychological and social support. We want to understand not just what's injured in their body, but what's hurting in their life." "What about the clinic's social aspect?" "Half of our slots will be free for low-income patients, and we'll continue our project connecting young people and seniors." Richard watched the interview and thought about how much Jake had grown while staying true to himself, his genuine care for others. 6 months later, the clinic Steps of Hope opened its doors. The name had been Mrs. Margaret's suggestion, and everyone agreed it was perfect. "Jake," Richard said on opening day, "are you nervous?" "A little. It's a big responsibility, but I'm also really excited." "And your team is ready?" "Yes. I hired physical therapists who share the same human-centered approach. We also have psychologists and social workers. The opening drew hundreds of people, elderly patients who had regained mobility, young people who had found direction in life, local officials and healthcare professionals curious about Jake's innovative methods. "Jake," said Dr. Charles, a respected local physician, "do you really believe your approach is more effective than traditional methods?" "Dr. Charles, I don't think it's better. I think it's more complete. Traditional methods treat the body, and that's essential. But if we don't also care for a person's emotions and motivations, the treatment is incomplete. Do you have any studies to support this?" "We're starting research with the university, but I can give you a real-life example." Jake pointed to Mrs. Margaret, who was chatting with other seniors. "My grandmother went 5 years without walking, even though she was physically capable. What changed wasn't just the physical treatment, it was the emotional care." Dr. Charles watched Mrs. Margaret and looked visibly impressed. And she really hadn't walked in 5 years. 5 years. And today, at 73, she's one of the most active people I know. During the opening celebration, Mrs. Margaret insisted on giving a speech. "I want to tell a story," she began. 8 years ago, I was a bitter woman who felt useless and defeated. I thought my life had ended at 65 when I fell and stopped walking." The audience listened in silence. "Then a skinny, dirty street kid came into my life and said he could make me walk again. My son almost threw him out, and I almost didn't believe him. But that boy saw something in me that I couldn't see anymore. Potential." Mrs. Margaret looked at Jake, who was emotional. "Jake didn't just teach me how to move my legs, he taught me to want to move them. He taught me it's worth trying, even when you're afraid of falling. He taught me that family is about love, not blood. And he taught me it's never too late to start a new life." The audience was visibly moved. Today, seeing this clinic open, seeing Jake become a respected professional, seeing our family happy and united, I know everything we went through was worth it. Because our story isn't just ours. It belongs to everyone who needs to believe it's possible to start over. The applause was long and heartfelt. Richard felt his mother had perfectly summed up their journey. In the first few months of operation, the Steps of Hope clinic treated dozens of patients. The results were impressive. The recovery rate was significantly higher than the national average. "Jake," said Professor Susan, who was tracking the results for research, "how do you explain these numbers?" "Professor, when people feel truly heard and understood, when they find personal reasons to want to get better, the body responds in amazing ways." "Can you give a specific example?" "We have a patient, Mr. Joseph, 70 years old, who stopped walking after losing his wife. Physically, he could walk, but emotionally, he had given up." "And how did you treat him?" "First, we listened to his story. He told us about his wife, about how he felt guilty for not taking better care of her in her final years. Then, we helped him find a way to honor her memory." "How so?" "He decided he wanted to walk again, so he could visit her grave every Sunday and bring fresh flowers. Once he found that purpose, his physical recovery sped up dramatically. Cases like Mr. Joseph's multiplied at the clinic. People who had lost hope found new reasons to fight. "Jake," Richard said during a family dinner, "you're changing lives in ways I never thought possible." "Dad, I'm just applying what I learned from you, that love and understanding can heal things medicine and exercise alone can't." "And how do you see the clinic's future?" "I dream of expanding the concept. I want to open more locations, train other professionals, maybe even write books about this approach." "What about your personal life? Don't you think about dating, starting a family?" Jake smiled. "Dad, I already have a family, you, and now I have the clinic, which is like an extended family. When the time is right for other relationships, it'll happen naturally." Richard admired Jake's maturity. At 23, he had a clarity about his priorities and goals that many people take decades to develop. A year after the clinic's opening, Jake received an unexpected invitation. "Jake," said Dr. Charles, his former professor, "the Department of Health wants to learn about your work." "What do you mean, Professor?" "They heard about your results and want to explore implementing your methodology in public hospitals." Jake was stunned. The possibility of seeing his approach applied on a large scale was a dream he never imagined could come true so soon. Professor, that would be amazing. But am I really ready for such a big responsibility? Jake, you were ready to change one person's life when you were just 13. Now, at 24, you're more than ready to change thousands of lives. The meeting with representatives from the Department of Health took place right at the clinic. They wanted to see firsthand how Jake's methodology worked. Dr. Jake, said Dr. Regina, the coordinator of public health policies, your results are truly impressive. How do you achieve these numbers? Dr. Regina, what sets us apart is treating the whole person, not just the injury. We take the time to understand each patient's life story, their fears, their motivations. And doesn't that make treatment more expensive? At first, yes. But in the medium term, the cost is lower because patients recover faster and with fewer chances of relapse. And would it be possible to train other professionals in this methodology? Of course. In fact, I'm developing a specialization course in partnership with the university. By the end of the visit, Dr. Regina was convinced. Dr. Jake, we'd like to propose a pilot project. We want to implement your methodology in 5 public hospitals in the region and evaluate the results. Jake could hardly believe what he was hearing. Dr. Regina, it would be an honor to be part of this project. That night, during a family dinner, Jake shared the Department of Health's proposal. Jake, do you realize the magnitude of what's happening? Richard asked. Dad, it's surreal. When I was a street kid, my biggest dream was just to have a place to sleep and guaranteed food. I never imagined I could impact public health policies. Jake, Mrs. Margaret said, remember when you told me you could make me walk again? I do, Grandma. Back then you already had this vision that you could change lives. The difference is that now you have the resources and knowledge to do it on a much larger scale. Grandma, none of this would be possible if you hadn't believed in me, if you hadn't given me love, education, opportunities. Jake, Richard said, emotional, you're the one who gave us a real family. We're just giving back what we received. The pilot project with the Department of Health was an extraordinary success. Within 6 months, the 5 participating hospitals showed a 40% improvement in physical therapy patient recovery rates. Dr. Jake, Dr. Regina called with the news, the results have exceeded all expectations. We want to expand the project statewide. Dr. Regina, that's wonderful, but I'll need a much larger team to train all the necessary professionals. Don't worry about resources. The project now has national priority. Jake was living a dream he never knew he had. His methodology was being recognized and implemented on a scale that could impact thousands of lives. But recognition also brought new challenges. Jake had to travel constantly, to give trainings, supervise implementations, attend conferences. Jake, Mrs. Margaret said one morning as he prepared for yet another trip, aren't you overworking yourself? A little, Grandma, but it's a good kind of tired. Knowing our methodology is helping people across the country gives me energy. Just don't forget to take care of yourself too. What good is healing others if you end up sick? Jake smiled. Mrs. Margaret was still his wisest advisor. Grandma, I promise I'll take better care of myself. And I also promise that no matter how much success we achieve, our family will always be my priority. During one of his trips to train professionals in another state, Jake met Dr. Emily, a 26-year-old physical therapist who worked at a public hospital, had become deeply interested in his methodology. Dr. Jake, she said after one of the training sessions, your approach reminds me so much of what my grandmother used to say about medicine. What did she say? That healing is more than prescribing medicine. It's about listening, understanding, loving. Jake was intrigued by Emily's perspective, and they began exchanging ideas about humanized physical therapy. Emily, do you apply this philosophy in your work? I try, but I don't always have time. The public system is so rushed, so many patients, so little time. What if there was a way to apply our methodology even with limited time? That would be amazing. Do you have any ideas? Jake and Emily began working together to develop a simplified version of the methodology that could be applied even in resource-limited settings. Jake, Richard observed during one of Emily's visits to the clinic, You two work very well together. Dad, Emily is an exceptional professional and an incredible person too. Is that all? Jake smiled, a little awkwardly. Dad, she's special, but I don't know if it's mutual. Jake, you teach people to have the courage to start over. Maybe it's time for you to find that courage too. A few months later, during a national physical therapy conference where Jake was the keynote speaker, he invited Emily to present the work they had developed together. Dr. Emily and I have created an adaptation of our methodology for resource-limited settings, Jake explained. We want to show that it's possible to humanize care even in challenging circumstances. The presentation was a success, and afterward, Jake mustered his courage. Emily, can I take you to dinner? Not as co-workers, but as people who care for each other. Emily smiled. Jake, I've been waiting months for you to ask. The relationship between Jake and Emily blossomed naturally. They shared not just a profession, but similar values and dreams. Jake, Emily said, during a weekend spent at the Mitchell family home, your family is amazing. They really liked you too. Mrs. Margaret told me the story of how you met. It's incredible how love can transform lives. Emily, that's what I've believed since I was a child. That love is the most powerful force there is, more powerful than medicine, exercises, money. And you live that in everything you do. I try. And you inspire me to be even better. 2 years later, Jake and Emily married in a simple but emotional ceremony held in the garden of the Steps of Hope Clinic. Jake, Richard said during his father of the groom speech, seeing you happy, fulfilled both professionally and personally is the greatest joy of my life. Dad, thank you for giving me the chance to have a family, an education, opportunities. None of this would have been possible without your love. Jake, you're the one who gave us a real family. Emily, welcome to our family. I know you two will be very happy together. Mrs. Margaret, now 76, was radiant during the wedding. Jake, she said during the newlyweds dance, remember when you were that skinny boy who showed up in the square? I remember, Grandma. It feels like a lifetime ago. And now you're a successful man, married to a wonderful woman, changing lives across the country. Grandma, none of this would have been possible if you hadn't believed in me. Jake, I just saw what was already inside you. The potential was always there. The celebration lasted late into the night, filled with stories and plans for the future. Emily, Mrs. Margaret said to her new daughter-in-law during the reception, welcome to the family. I hope you'll be very happy with our Jake. Mrs. Margaret, thank you for raising such a wonderful man. Jake has a huge heart, and I know I learned that from you and Richard. Emily, now you're part of our story, and I'm sure you'll help write even more beautiful chapters. In the following years, Jake and Emily worked together, expanding the humanized physical therapy methodology. They opened 2 new clinics and wrote a book that became a reference in the field. Jake, Emily said during breakfast, I have some news to share. What news? We're expecting a baby. Jake was speechless for a few seconds, then stood up and hugged Emily, crying with joy. Emily, I can hardly believe it. We're going to be parents. Yes, we're going to have our own family, but always within the bigger family you introduced me to. When they shared the news with Richard and Mrs. Margaret, the joy was overwhelming. A great-grandchild, Mrs. Margaret exclaimed. I can't believe I'm going to be a great-grandmother. Mom, Richard said, emotional, our family keeps growing. Richard, my son, when you first brought Jake home, I never imagined we'd reach this moment, from a woman in a wheelchair to a happy, active great-grandmother. 9 months later, Margaret Mitchell was born, named after her great-grandmother. The little girl brought even more joy and unity to the family. Jake, Richard said, holding his granddaughter in his arms, she has your eyes when you were little, that same special sparkle. Dad, I hope she inherits the kindness of this family, not just the eyes. Jake, a child raised with love always inherits kindness. Mrs. Margaret, now 78, was enchanted by her great-granddaughter. Margaret, she sang to the baby, great-grandma is going to teach you how to walk when you grow up. And she'll tell you the story of how Grandpa Jake taught great-grandma to walk again. Jake watched his grandmother with his daughter and felt the circle had closed perfectly. "Grandma," he said one afternoon, "do you remember when you told me you'd never walk again?" "I do, my grandson. I had lost hope. And now look at you, walking, caring for your great-granddaughter, inspiring others. Jake, you taught me it's never too late to start over. Now I want to teach that to our Margaret. She'll have the most loving family in the world to learn about life. She will, and she'll grow up knowing family is about love, not blood." On a sunny afternoon, when Margaret was 2, the whole family gathered in the garden. Richard played with his granddaughter, Emily read a book, Jake spoke with patients over video calls, and Mrs. Margaret, now 80, was planting flowers. "Jake," Mrs. Margaret called, "come help me with these seedlings." Jake knelt beside his grandmother. "Grandma, don't you ever get tired of working in the garden?" "Jake, planting is like caring for people. You put the seed in the soil, give it water, love, and care, and wait for it to grow, just like you did with me." "Grandma, you were the one who planted love and care in me first." "Jake, look around us," Mrs. Margaret pointed to the gathered family. "All of this grew from that day in the square when you said you could make me walk again. And you believed me. And you didn't let me down. You didn't just make me walk, you gave me a family, a purpose, a new life." Jake looked around and saw Richard teaching Margaret her first steps, Emily smiling proudly, the house full of life and love. "Grandma, do you think our story had a happy ending?" "Jake, our story didn't have an ending. It continues every day, with every person you help, every life we change, every day we choose to love." "You're right. So what's the next chapter?" "Watching our Margaret grow, continuing to help people, staying a close family. And who knows, if God wills it, maybe you and Emily will give this great-grandma more grandchildren." Jake laughed and hugged Mrs. Margaret. "Grandma, thank you for believing in a street kid who said he could make you walk again. Jake, thank you for keeping your promise, and for giving me so much more than steps. You gave me a whole life to live." The sun was setting, painting the garden gold, and the whole family was together, happy and united. The little girl, Margaret, took her first steps alone that day, running into her father's arms. "Daddy!" she shouted, throwing herself at Jake. "My princess! You walked all by yourself!" "Just like great-grandma," Jake looked at Mrs. Margaret, who was radiant with joy. "Just like great-grandma," he repeated, moved. The story that had begun with a street boy promising to make an elderly woman walk again had turned into a saga of love, perseverance, and family. One that would continue to be written for generations. Richard watched the scene and thought about how his life had completely changed since that day in the square. He hadn't just gained a son, but an entirely new perspective on what truly mattered in life. "Jake," he called, as everyone was getting ready to go inside. "Yes, Dad?" "Thank you for teaching me that family is about love, not blood, and that true wealth lies in the people we love. Dad, thank you for giving me the chance to be part of this family, for believing in a street kid when no one else would. Jake, you're the one who gave us a real family." They walked into the house together, 4 generations united by love and the certainty that they had built something truly special. That evening, during dinner, Margaret was trying to eat by herself, making a mess, but everyone laughed and enjoyed her attempts. "Daddy," she suddenly said, "were you little like me?" "I was, Princess. Very little." "And Grandpa Richard took care of you when you were little?" "He did. And Grandma Margaret too." "And now you take care of me?" "Yes, and we always will." Margaret smiled and went back to playing with her food. "Jake," Emily said softly, "she's growing up in a family so full of love. It's what she deserves, what every child deserves. And if one day she asks about your childhood before you came here, I'll tell her the whole truth, how I met this family, how they welcomed me, how love can change any situation. She'll grow up knowing family is about choice and love, exactly like I learned." After dinner, when Margaret was asleep and Emily was resting, Jake and Richard stayed on the porch talking. "Dad, sometimes I look at our life and it feels surreal." "Why, son?" "I think about that desperate boy who slept on the street, who had nothing but the clothes on his back. And now I look at all this, family, career, recognition, my own daughter." "Jake, You always had the most important thing, a good heart. Everything else came from that. But without the opportunity you gave me, Jake, opportunity without merit doesn't take anyone far. You made the most of every chance, every lesson, every moment to grow and help others. Dad, can I confess something? Of course. Sometimes I'm afraid this is all a dream, and I'll wake up under that bench in the square. Richard put his hand on Jake's shoulder. Son, this is real. Your family is real. Your love is real. And even if it were a dream, you deserve to dream it forever. Thank you, Dad, for everything. Thank you, Jake, for making me a father, Mom a grandmother, and our house a family. They sat in silence for a few minutes, watching the stars and reflecting on the journey that had brought them there. Dad, Jake finally said, what's your biggest wish for the future? To see you all happy, to see Margaret grow up healthy and loved, and to keep being useful as long as God gives me strength. My biggest wish is to honor everything I've learned from you, to be a good father, a good husband, a good professional, and to keep helping people the way you helped me. Jake, you're already doing all that, and more than that, you're multiplying the love you received. That's what I want, for our story to inspire other families to believe in the power of love. And it is inspiring. How many people have stopped me on the street to tell me how our story motivated them? It's true, but the most important thing is that our story isn't just ours. It belongs to everyone who believes it's possible to start over. Exactly, son. And this story will keep being written through Margaret, your future children, the patients you help. A story without end. The best story I could have lived. Richard and Jake embraced, father and son united by love and gratitude for everything they had built together. Inside the house, Mrs. Margaret was in the living room, holding Margaret in her arms and telling her a story to help her fall asleep. Once upon a time, there was a very special boy, she began, who came into the life of a sad grandma and said he could make her walk again. The little girl listened with wide eyes, even as she grew drowsy. And did the grandma walk? Yes, she did, my princess. And not only did she walk, she danced, she played, and she gained a whole family to love. And the boy? The boy became your daddy, and they lived happily ever after. Like in the movies. Better than the movies, my love, because this is real. Margaret fell asleep in her great-grandmother's arms, and Mrs. Margaret carried her to the crib, humming softly. My dear great-granddaughter, she whispered, you'll grow up in a family full of love, surrounded by people who believe in dreams and never give up on each other. When everyone was already asleep, Jake took one last look at his daughter's room. Margaret slept peacefully, wrapped in love and safety. Princess, he whispered, Daddy promises you'll always have a family who loves you, believes in you, and teaches you that any dream is possible when we have love. Jake left the room and found Emily waiting for him. How was your day? She asked. Perfect. Absolutely perfect. Jake, are you happy? Happier than I ever imagined possible. And what makes you happiest? Having all of you, being able to help people, knowing our Margaret will grow up in a family full of love, and waking up every day knowing my life has purpose. Jake, have you ever stopped to think about how many lives you've changed? Emily, I think more about how many lives have changed me. Every person I've met, every patient I've helped, every moment with our family, all of it has shaped me into the man I am today. And you have no regrets? None. Not even the hard times, because they brought me here. Jake, you're amazing. Margaret is going to have the best father in the world, and the best grandfather and great-grandmother too. Our daughter will grow up knowing family means unconditional love. They hugged and went to sleep, grateful for another day of happiness with the family they had built together. The next morning, Jake woke up early and went to the kitchen to make coffee for everyone. Mrs. Margaret was already there, preparing breakfast. Good morning, Grandma. Did you sleep well? Very well, my grandson. And you? Like a baby. Grandma, can I ask you something? Of course. Did you ever imagine our story would have this ending? Mrs. Margaret stopped what she was doing and looked at Jake with that wise smile he knew so well. "Jake, when you showed up in the square that day, I saw something in your eyes that gave me hope. I didn't know exactly what would happen, but I knew it would be something special. And now I know our story has no ending. Oh, it will keep going through Margaret, your children, the patients you treat, the people you inspire. Grandma, thank you for believing in me when I was just a street kid. Jake, thank you for keeping every promise and for giving me so much more than I ever asked for." Richard appeared in the kitchen, followed by Emily with Margaret in her arms. "Good morning, family," Richard said, kissing his mother on the forehead and hugging Jake. "Good morning, Daddy," Margaret said, still sleepy. "Good morning, Princess. How did you sleep?" "Good. Great-grandma told me a story about when Daddy was little." Richard smiled. "And what did you think of the story?" "I liked it. Daddy was brave when he was little." "He still is brave," Emily said, kissing Jake. During breakfast, they talked about their plans for the day, the week, and the future. It was an ordinary conversation for an ordinary family, but filled with extraordinary love. "Jake," Richard said, "this afternoon I'll stop by the clinic. I want to check on the new patients." "Dad, you don't have to. You already do so much for the clinic." "Jake, that clinic is part of our family. It's where our story continues to be written every day." "You're right, and Margaret loves going there too." "Children always know how to recognize places full of love," Mrs. Margaret observed. After breakfast, Jake got ready to go to the clinic. Before leaving, he said goodbye to everyone with hugs and kisses. "Jake," Mrs. Margaret called him at the door, "do you remember the promise you made to me on that first day?" "I do. I promised I'd make you walk again. And what you really did was so much more than that. You made me live again. Grandma, you're the one who taught me what family love is, and now you teach that to others every day. It's what I learned from all of you, to multiply the love we receive." Jake hugged his grandmother one more time and left for another day of work, carrying in his heart all the gratitude and joy of being part of that extraordinary family. At the clinic, he was greeted by staff and patients with their usual warmth. Every day there was a new opportunity to apply the lessons of love and hope he had learned at home. "Dr. Jake," said Mrs. Mary, a 65-year-old patient who had arrived at the clinic depressed and unwilling to exercise, "thank you for not giving up on me." "Mrs. Mary, I learned from my family that we should never give up on the people we love. And here, everyone is family. Doctor, you gave me back not just the movement in my legs, but the joy of living." "Mrs. Mary, the joy was always there. I just helped you find it again." Conversations like this happened every day at the clinic, confirming for Jake that he had found his true calling in life, helping people rediscover their ability to love, dream, and start anew. At the end of the day, as Jake headed home, he always took the same route, passing by the square where he had first met Richard and Mrs. Margaret. It was a ritual of gratitude he had developed over the years. "Thank you," he always murmured, looking at the bench where it all began. "Thank you for believing in me. Thank you for giving me a family. Thank you for teaching me that love can transform anything." When he arrived home, he was always greeted with celebration. Margaret ran into his arms. Emily kissed him. Richard asked about his day, and Mrs. Margaret always had a warm cup of coffee waiting. "How was your day, my love?" Emily always asked. "Another blessed day," Jake always replied. "Another day where I got to help people and come home knowing I have the most wonderful family in the world." And so the days passed, each one bringing new joys, new challenges, and new reasons to be grateful for the journey that had brought them together. End of story. Now tell me, what did you think of this story of perseverance and family love? Do you believe Jake made the right decisions along his journey? Which part of the story moved you the most? Share your honest thoughts in the comments. We love hearing what our listeners think. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss other heartwarming stories we'll prepare for you.